Okay, hello. We're lecturing about various topics in terms of reading and going for theory, I think from both the apt and the nice perspective. And we're starting on T and spec. T stands for topicality, where interpretations generally consist of like a definition of the word within the resolution and are accompanied by a quote-unquote violation as to why the affirmative plan doesn't fall under that definition or doesn't satisfy that definition and thus isn't topical. This definition, that whatever you want to provide as a negation, need not necessarily be the conventional definition of a word, i.e., you might insist that the affirmative only defend nuclear weapons on a topic about like offensive weaponry. Whatever you can argue would be good or at least better than whatever the affirmative actions were in this particular round, you can defend as a topicality inter. Spec argues that the affirmative must specify something, i.e. where their funding comes from, or maybe the types of things that they increase, or maybe even the weighing mechanism of the round. Some typical standards on T and spec include depth of education, because for example, if we were able to specify something or debate about some specific instantiation of the resolution, we might get better depth of education on that topic. Jurisdiction, because if the affirmative isn't topical, then maybe like you just shouldn't be voting for them. Or maybe complain that the affirmative is extra topical, i.e. derived extra offense from their choice of plan text that wasn't supposed to be part of their ground as per the resolution, and thus like you couldn't predict it or something. Spec might have any number of cool advantages as to whatever that you insist that the affirmative specify. Like maybe, for example, you complain that the affirmative didn't specify what US senators voted to pass the bill, which was crucial to your politics disadvantage or something. But yeah, tons of offense you can read on T and spec.
Cool. General heuristic is if the thing that you thought was going to link in prep that you're smart and had every reason to believe should have doesn't, then there's something wrong. And that's usually what T or spec is trying to get you back links to, right? So the last part of the spec or T debate are your voting issues, and these are usually framed through two different areas, which are either competing interpretations or reasonability. Oftentimes when negatives read a voting issue, they will say that the debate round should be based off of competing interpretations, and that means basically that you want to think about weighing definitions the same way that you would any other piece of offense in the debate round, right? So you look to standards and you determine which standard has the most important impact, and whichever team wins that they have the best link into their impact should win. And that's sort of what competing interpretations ask the judge to do, just evaluate the offense as it exists at the end of the debate round. Affirmative teams will sometimes respond to competing interpretations by saying that instead of competing interpretations, the theory should be evaluated based off of reasonability. If you're making this argument, a key pitfall is that often the argument against reasonability is that it invites judge intervention, since everybody has a different definition about what counts as reasonable. So if you're apt and you're making reasonability arguments, it's important that you have a standard for determining what counts as reasonable. Sometimes that means just win one counter standard. I think the more obvious one is to say if they don't demonstrate in-round abuse, then you should not vote for them, because that sets some kind of bright line over having a race to the bottom of competing interpretations. So that's competing interpretations and reasonability.
Cool. So what happens if the affirmative stands up and reads a criticism that you have no idea what is going on, and all of your disads now no longer link? Well, framework theory can be used, or framework topicality, framework T, sometimes called long-form framework, can be used to essentially try to get some of that ground back. Using the framework structure, we can go over the different parts. But first, starting with the interpretation, the affirmative needs to be able to be tied to the resolution. So it needs to be able to identify that the affirmative must do some part of the resolution vis-a-vis the actor, or some vis-a-vis the action, right? Sometimes it's both. But for instance, in interpretation, the PMC must defend the enactment of the policy specified in the resolution done by the actor specified in the resolution, would tie the affirmative to the resolution in those two ways. The violation would be one of three things. It's either the violation in that the actor is not used in the resolution, or the action by the resolution is not done, and sometimes extra T, right? Tim talked about extra T, and sometimes the affirmative will attempt to do something outside of the resolution. Maybe they will defend the resolution, but also do a bunch of other things. Maybe their speech act will be part of the offense. And maybe your interpretation can pin them to that. For the standards, I think there are two things that are necessary in Framework T. The first are reasons education of the topic or resolution can be weighed against the education of the affirmative. This is important because ostensibly the resolutional education that you garner from talking about the resolution that kind of education is good, right? And the affirmative is going to say that their education is kind of good. So it's up to you to be able to beat back against those claims with a standard that says so. The second is a reason that the defense of the topic or debates about the resolution ensure fairness, right? These are these kind of arguments that the resolution is the only stable locus of disagreement, ergo that disagreeing about the one thing is necessary to ensure fairness. Some other optional standards. One is a reason that the education of the criticism might be bad. For instance, there is no bad education to policy debates because there's no negative impact. None of us are policymakers. But if you win the affirmative and its education is flawed, this spreads the solvency of the affirmative. And maybe people misinterpret or reinterpret the affirmative solvency. And that creates bad education further down the road. And the second standard that I think is optional but oftentimes very, very useful is a topical version of the affirmative. A topical version of the affirmative is a way that the affirmative could be defended while defending the resolution. And this is useful because it resolves a lot of the offense that they might be reading on the interpretation, right? Allowing the affirmative to be able to, rather allowing the negative to be able to have access in the round would resolve lots of the complaints that the framework theory is attempting to levy. For voters, I think fairness and education are pretty standard, but specifically for fairness, it's important to read fairness as a sequencing argument, being able to hypotest the affirmative or test the affirmative from multiple different angles is oftentimes articulated as a prior question because it's necessary to determine whether or not the affirmative is true in the first place or should be read in the first place.
Cool, so now we can go ahead and start talking about MG theory because the LOC is not the only one that can read theory sheets, and MG theory is something that we kind of think about a lot, and it's something that you'll hear in a lot of debates, and yeah, let's talk about it. So MG theory is usually not about the definitions of words, rather it's the LOC strategies itself and some kind of argument that however the LOC strategy was deployed was somehow bad for the affirmative's ability to engage within the debate. The most common by far theory sheet that you'll hear in the MG is always going to be condo, which is conditionality and the idea that the negative should be allowed to read a counterplan or an advocacy and then just pretend it never happened come the MO. So obviously that makes the MG a bit harder because now we spent precious minutes of our MG answering something that's functionally no longer in the debate by the next speech. It's not super fun, and so one of the ways that we can kind of ensure that that doesn't kill our ability to engage in the debate, we can read a sheet that basically says you should not be allowed to do that. And I think for conditionality, this is something that my partner and I haven't really read all year, and I think our approach to it is probably a little bit different than most teams, and that we've been having a lot of hard rounds, and sometimes we just make this decision not to read it even when there is an abuse or a violation. And our rationale and our kind of approach to that is that MG theory should be read if we feel like it is absolutely necessary, and we'll do so in those instances. Or when we just want to make the MO a lot harder. And there's not a lot of instances outside of those two that we can think of that we really have been reading MG theory, but a lot of times it's just maybe we really messed up, the LOC is just crazy good, but then they say they're condo and we need some kind of a priori reason that we win. And it functions pretty similarly to LOC theory, except for the negative really only gets one chance to respond, right? And then we get to our PMR and we get to basically collapse to it if we want to go for it. I think the nice thing about MG theory is that, the block only has one chance to respond, which means that we get a bunch of new answers in the PMR, but that also means that a lot of judges will have a higher threshold for voting on MG theory. And I think how we've kind of gotten around that is if it is a round where we feel like we're not super strapped for time, then we can just read it as kind of a time suck and we won't collapse to it. Though the optics of that, might change depending on your judge. So it's something that's very high risk, high reward. And then there are other types of MG theory. There's MG theory that specifically has to do with like counterplans. Maybe they delay the AF, or they get to like pick out of like some very tiny piece of a very large bill. And basically all MG theory is that's bad and you should lose for doing that.
Awesome, cool. So now I'm gonna get into some of the more like back off the debate stuff, collapsed into theory, and I'm just gonna go over the basic structure and interp standard stuff in the MO and also the PMR if you do happen to be going for MG theory. So you want to start from the interp level and just gain access to your interp. So this means you need to answer the we meet, and this usually means extending the substance of the violation, explaining why it differs from the text of the we meet, and also you need to literally like say extend my interpretation. You can handle the counter interpretation here or after doing the rest of your extensions on like your sheet. It's dependent on your preferences. However, if there's really specific arguments related to the counter-interpretation, i.e. the counter-interpretation has a rhetorical flaw or your opponents don't meet their counter-interpretation, then I would say that it's probably best to do that analysis here. I like to answer the counter-interpretation alongside the interpretation because it just feels more clean to me to like separate the debate into layers of like interp level, standards level, voters level, but it's really up to your preference. So you can often just do comparative analysis of the two, like weigh the interp versus the counter-interp like in and of themselves, but sometimes it's also helpful to bring in external disadvantages or offense to the counter-interpretation that was read. On the standards level, you want to choose one standard that you want to go for ahead of time as your offense. So the basic level stuff you want to do here is extend your argument and handle your opponent's answer to your standard, which obviously is much easier said than done. So yeah, just extend your standard, and they're probably gonna put defense or offense on it, but you just have to do like the work about why they probably have misunderstood your standard or why your standard is necessarily key. I think like a common standard for like T debate is limits, and they might answer that by saying, well, actually afflex is better, but then you probably want to come in with some arguments about why limiting the affirmative is better because the affirmative is going to have like flex regardless. Negative flex is more important than affirmative flex, and that's only guaranteed in a world of limits. Like that sort of comparative work. And then after you kind of like handle the basic level, like I have access to my standard in and of itself, you need to choose your voter, which is the impact to your standard. So after you have one that you have access to your standard, the important part is doing the explicit like analysis about why your standard is the best internal link to your voter, and this is where I think like you're going to win the theory debate. So yeah, and then Pascal is going to do the explanation about like choosing your voter and like doing the explanative work on your voter. But yeah, make sure that you have to win that your standard is the best internal link to your voter. I.e., if your standard you're going for is limits, you can say that limits is the best internal link to fairness because limiting the affirmative to only the resolution means that the negative has a stable locus for engagement, which means that we can have like an equal 20 minutes of preparation beforehand and have some sort of clash. Whatever you want your argument to be, but like choose fairness education and then use your standards internally to that. Then you have all the floating offense that your opponent has put on the standards level. I like to deal with that after I've already like dealt with the question of my standards. You want to leverage your standard that you've already won against your opponent's standards and also put independent offense or defense against your opponent's standards if you can or if you have time to do that. Once again, on the voters level, Pascal will explain how you go for a specific voter, but assuming you've already won your voter, explain why your opponent's standards do not internal link to that voter. Additionally, if there are offensive answers to one of your standards, to a standard that you are not going for, you should answer it if it's one, offensive, or two, it can be cross-applied to the standard that you are going for. But other than that, I personally don't think that it's super necessary to answer the rest of your opponent's answers, which kind of helps you get like a nice time trade-off.
Yeah, so like Brenda described, it's really common to end up in a scenario on theory debate in which you're going to be weighing one set of standards against another set of standards. And the analog of this in a policy debate would basically be weighing one like link story against another link story. So in order to tiebreak between these, we can either be doing basically impact weighing or separate independent weighing based on those link chains. So the most important and most common thing on a theory debate is going to be to do impact weighing, which ends up being voter weighing. Because as we've talked about, almost always shells are either going to go for fairness or education as voters. Probably the most common debate you're going to get into in terms of theory weighing is going to be on the debate between fairness in education. And there are lots of reasons why education comes first and why fairness comes first. Some pretty common ones are that education is the only portable impact debate. So like it won't impact you in 10 years if this round is more or less fair, but maybe you'll learn something from debate if it's more educational. And on the other side, the fairness comes first because it's an internal link to education, i.e. the reason why we do debate is because it's a presumably fair game, and if it's not fair, we can't get access to any of the clash and engagement we want to get access to in education. So those sorts of arguments are actually really common on framework T, which often goes for fairness comes first, because you can't evaluate any other arguments in debate if it's not fair, because the way we check if things are true in debate is evaluating them under fair clash. That's called fairness T's evaluation. But because you end up with a lot of time to do weighing, and weighing becomes really important on most theory debates, since it's very common for both teams to be winning some harms to their interp or counter-interp, weighing debates can get substantially more complicated than that. Part of that's a function of the fact that the 12 minutes of the block and the golden turns of the PMR mean that it's really easy to win at least one standards chain for each team typically, and part of that's because the last two speeches, the last 9 minutes of the round, can only make weighing in terms of new arguments other than golden turns. So there are a lot of other weighing type arguments you can read. So in the competing interpretations, one classic example is the difference between proven and potential abuse, i.e. the difference between abuse that could potentially occur because of the wording of a counter-interpretation. For instance, they could kick their counter plan, which would mean we wouldn't be able to extend any of the offense we've written the MG through into the PMR, forcing the MG to split up the strategy, versus they do kick their counter plan, so there's actually implications to that. A lot of judges default to only potential abuse mattering under competing interpretations, because a common phrase used to justify that is that competing interps isn't what you are, it's what you justify, i.e. your interpretation matters more than what you actually do. However, you can definitely get back to proven abuse by making arguments like proven abuse is the only 100% probability link into potential abuse, i.e. if something is proven abuse, we know that it occurred, therefore we know that it potentially could occur, whereas anything else is less probable. That hints at another category of weighing you can do, which is basically standard probability magnitude time. Even time frame if you really want to weigh, but probability and magnitude are by far the most common, where you weigh like how likely an abuse is to occur, how significant the effect of that abuse is on the outcome of the round, and then like other aspects of those impacts. One final thing on theory weighing, one really common argument on theory that doesn't come up much on case rounds, but probably should more, is arguments that one impact is an internal link to or short circuits another impact. So like I was saying earlier about how fairness is the internal link to education is a common argument. It's pretty common to read arguments that one standard or one voter controls access to another standard or voter, which basically means that if you don't have access to that impact, you can't get any of the other impacts, so it's functionally not unique. This may sound complicated in jargon. Basically, you can think of theory debate as a scaled down version of the offense-defense paradigm of case debate, localized to the rules of the round. Hopefully that's helpful.
All right, nice job.